Good morning and good afternoon to everyone as we have attendees from coast to coast here with us today. My name is Catherine Deline and I serve as the Senior Director of Clinical Services for Hospice, who is the maker of the Macy catheter. Now, on behalf of Hospice, it is my pleasure to introduce to today's webinar speaker, Shelley Henry. Shelley is a registered nurse with over 30 years of experience. She's dedicated the last 20 years, though, to working in hospice, holding positions from field nurse to DON, administrator, regional director of operations over multiple states, director of quality for a large hospice company, and vice president of corporate compliance for another large hospice company. Now, 5 years ago, concerned by the changing hospice landscape and the dwindling pool of hospice nurses, which we're all experiencing, Shelley decided to start a company with the goal of bringing hospice nurses back into the field and preserving that art of hospice nursing. And her company, the Amity Group, creates solutions for some of the most challenging areas faced by hospice agencies and hospice nurses. We are so lucky to have her with us today to reveal insights from her recent survey of hospice field nurses. She polled nurses across the nation, and the study was designed to gain insight into the areas that are important specifically to them. Shelley, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Catherine. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share this information with everybody. So I will tell y'all, this is the first time I've done it in this type of format. I've given this presentation before, but more like gave it at the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization in front of audience. So I'm going to try to not talk too fast or rush too much, but I'm also going to hopefully won't ramble too much. So just bear with me. This is my first time doing this. So let's see. First thing, I don't have any relevant financial relationships to disclose with any ineligible companies. And so the objectives of here, what we're going to cover today, as Catherine said, I did a survey of hospice nurses. And what I'm going to talk about today are the results of the survey, the areas. We identified 3 areas of main concern from the survey. And then after we go through the survey step in the second half of the presentation, I'll do some solutions and some ideas that we have of things that could help to fix some of these areas. So just a little introduction of myself. Catherine did give y'all a little bit of background on myself, on my background. And the way I started doing this company, the reason I started for the survey is after starting my company, we've actually been in business for 7 years now. But when we first started, we provide staffing for hospice agencies. We only work for hospice agencies, and we do it more like a hospital does staffing you can get an agency nurse in a hospital. We're not contract or travel nurses. We are just strictly flexible staffing. I saw this as a need that hospice agencies, we just never had that option of, I have a nurse out sick, let me call an agency nurse. So we are that kind of agency. And whenever you first start a company, you spend a lot of time in the field. You spend a lot of time, you wear every hat. So after many years of working at the corporate level, I dusted off my scrubs and I went back into the field, because when I first started, it was just me and another nurse. And going back into hospice as a field nurse after being out of the field for probably 8 or 9 years, I was really, really shocked at how much things had changed, at how different it was. And I struggled with a lot of things. And I really wanted to know, is everybody struggling with the same stuff? Are all of us nurses facing these same issues? And if we are, maybe there's something we can do about it. But I couldn't figure out how am I going to know if everybody else is struggling with it? And so I was talking about it with my team, and we said, well, why don't we just ask the nurses? I mean, that makes the most sense. Let's just ask them and see what they're struggling with. And that's where we came up with the idea for the survey. And that was really the kind of genesis and the whole basis of the survey. Is I initially just wanted to see if everyone was having the same struggles that I was having. So we started this survey. And we were going to do the survey just like a social media survey, very informal, Instagram, TikTok survey kind of thing. But when we were talking about it, we thought, some of this data might be useful to other people. Hospice agencies may be able to use it to help with their staffing and that kind of thing. So that's why we decided to go with SurveyMonkey, because that way we could ensure that the data and the information from the survey that we gathered, that we could maintain the integrity of it. Because I don't know how many of y'all have used SurveyMonkey, but once you have that data in there, it's kind of locked in there. There's no changing it. So it is what it is. So we did the survey through SurveyMonkey. It ran for 6 months. We started June through December of last year. So it just ended December 31st of last year. The survey was open to RNs only. And the reason for that is because we have some questions on the survey that have to do with the admission process. And I wanted to make sure the data stayed pure. And since RNs are the only ones that can do admissions, we did only open it to RNs. Also, the RNs had to have recent hospice field experience, at least within the last 5 years. So I didn't want, like me, not having had that recent experience. I wanted people that were experiencing what we were experiencing right now. The survey was 100% anonymous. We didn't collect any demographic information whatsoever because I felt like, these days, so many people are concerned about your information being used for things other than the purpose. And I didn't want that to stop nurses from taking the survey and sharing their information with us. So I have no idea where the respondents are from, what part of the country, any of that. We don't know. And also we have no affiliates with this. We did this solely by ourselves. We don't have any kind of agenda. We paid for the SurveyMonkey. We paid all the cost of advertising and everything for it. And I know some people have told me, well, why would you do this? You own a staffing company for hospice agencies. Why would you do something to help hospice companies stay staffed better? Seems like it's kind of counterintuitive to your business, but it's not, because our business is meant to fill in those gaps. Like when you have a nurse that's out sick or a nurse on vacation, or you get an influx of patients, we're there. That's always going to be a thing. And so the more stable that the hospice companies are, I mean, the better it is for us. And that's what we want. And I feel like even if it would mean that our business wouldn't be needed anymore, I'm okay with that too, because I really believe in hospice, and we want to do everything we can to help make hospices, to help it make us easy and stable for the hospice companies. So in doing the survey, 3 main areas came out. What we saw expressed from the nurses, there were 3 main areas that came out as concerns. Number 1, hands down, without a doubt, documentation. Almost every nurse had something to say about documentation. You'll see a lot of the survey is focused on documentation because this is the area where I saw the biggest need and the biggest struggle also. But number 1 was documentation. Number 2 was patient ratios. That's the second thing we heard the concerns about. And number 3 was compensation. So what I'm going to do during this presentation is we're going to go through the survey, the data we got from the survey over these 3 areas. And then after we do that in the second half, we'll talk about some solutions and things that we can do to help solve some of these issues. So with documentation, we'll talk about that first. This is just some of the verbatims that came out of the survey. There's a bunch of verbatims that nurses left, and Catherine has the link for that. I think Molly has the link for that. She can send you those if you'd like to read them all. I think there's about 110 of them, 120. I don't remember right now, but there's quite a few. But this is just a snapshot. This is most of what they look like as far as focusing on documentation, that nurses are saying that we have too much documentation. We want more time with patients, less time documenting, less redundant documentation, less focus on documentation. And so one of the areas that we asked them about was about redundant documentation. This was something that I was seeing out in the field, a lot of redundancy in the documentation. And we defined, for the purpose of the survey, redundant documentation as information that is already in the medical record and or is entered 2 or more times in the medical record. So we asked the nurses what percentage of documentation they felt was redundant in their documentation. 0 nurses said they had no redundancy. So that means everybody says there's some amount of redundancy in their documentation. 1% of the nurses said that 10% of their documentation was redundant. 21% said that 20% was redundant. 45% of the nurses said that 50% of their documentation was redundant. So almost half of the nurses that respond said that half of their documentation that they do on a daily basis is redundant, meaning that it's information that is either already in the medical record or that they have to enter in 2 or more places. 24% of the nurses said that 75% of their documentation was redundant. 8% said 90%, and 3% said 100%. And so y'all, I almost took the 3%, that 100% out, because I felt like, well, my note is new, so that can't be redundant, right? But interestingly, we left it in because we said we weren't going to alter the data at all. So we left it in. And a couple of weeks after this, we went to work for a client who their process was, we would go out and see the patient. The documentation was done on an old-timey nurse's note, like we used to do in the old days. And then after all the patients were seen, the nurses would go back and enter the information into an EMR system. So I thought at first, okay, well, it's a new system. This is how you have to do this when you're transitioning into a new system. But it wasn't. It was a system they had been using for almost 3 years. And it was just that the owners of the company were not comfortable with the fact that whether the EMR was going to preserve their data or not. So their nurses were actually doing 100% redundancy. So it is a thing. It is a real thing. But so after we looked at the redundancy, I wanted to see what is the cost of this redundancy? And y'all forgive me for stopping a little. Things are covering up stuff on my screen, so I'm just kind of going on some of this from memory. But I wanted to see what the cost of the redundancy is. Actually, can we put a number on it? And so I talked with my team. So we got all of our nurses together, and we came up with what we see across the system, because we work in multiple agencies for multiple companies. We use multiple EMRs every day. So we got together and we actually came up with a list of 17 things that we all said, we pretty much see these redundancies in every EMR and every system. I took those 17 and we whittled it down to 6 because I wanted it to be kind of reasonable. And these were the main 6 things that we see in every EMR that we'll see some kind of redundancy usually. And that's having to document the BME, the BM in 3 places, the DME in the home, that's the same DME that's always been in the home. Their living situation that has not changed at all since we admitted them. If they wear glasses or hearing aids, and great detail into that kind of thing. With all the redundant scales that we do over and over that haven't changed. And fall assessments, especially if we have a patient that is a bedbound patient that's mostly unconscious, and we're doing these over and over fall assessments on them. We took these and we figured that this amount, just these 6, is about 10 minutes of redundant documentation that we have to do. And I know you think 10 minutes is not a big deal, and 10 minutes isn't a big deal, but we're not just seeing one patient. Let's say on a good day, we're seeing 6 patients. So now we are talking about 60 minutes of redundant documentation. That is 60 minutes. That's 1 hour every single day that we're wasting entering data that's already in the patient's record. So that's a lot. That's something that we really, really need to fix when we can. So then we asked the nurses, how much time are you spending documenting at home? So 3% of the nurses that responded said they don't spend any time documenting at home. 14% of the nurses said that they spend a half hour to an hour every night documenting at home. 20% said that they spend 1 to 2 hours a night documenting at home. 40% of the nurses that responded, so almost half of the nurses that responded, said that they spend 2 to 3 hours every night documenting at home. This is after they've done their full day of work, and then they're at home doing their documenting. And 22% said they spend more than 3 hours. So if you look at this, is significant. If you look at this, that this is just of the 2 to 3 hours, that's 62% of the nurses spend 2 to more than 3 hours a night documenting at home. And documenting after, and this is just routine documenting. This is not admission. So this would be your routine and probably your research. And so I know when I do this in person, I do like a little exercise where I talk about how the documenting in the home is not a great option. I know I've heard somewhere, and I don't know where this came from, that best practice is to finish your documentation in the home. But I would tell you that I don't really agree with that, especially since we're doing it on a tablet, because if we're in the patient's home for 30 minutes on a tablet, focused on the tablet, their perception is that we are not focused on them, that we're just focused on our tablet. And even if we tell them we're documenting, they're probably thinking, oh, they're on Facebook or on TikTok or just messing around on their tablet. So it's not a good, I don't think for our patient experience and our patient perception that documenting in the home is the best thing. And we don't recommend for our nurses to document in the home. I will document in my car most of the time. I'll do the patient and see the patient and let them know I'm going to spend a little time out in the car documenting. But if we have 8 patients to see that day, 9 patients to see, and we have any amount of driving time, most of the documentation is going to take about 30 minutes in the EMRs. There may not be time to do that and see the patients within the time frame that the patients want to be seen. So documenting in the home at the time of the visit is something that we have to consider alternate ways to do this. Because we can't have the nurses are spending 2, 3 or more hours a night documenting. So then we ask the nurses, how much time are you spending documenting an admission, including your internal notifications? Because sometimes I've worked at some places where we have to make, after we've done all of the documenting, we then have to fill out this big template within their internal system to send out to everybody. And sometimes those take 15 or 20 minutes to complete on top of the documenting that we've done. So we ask them, how much, including everything, do you spend documenting? So 2% of the nurses said they spend half hour to an hour documenting an admission. 11% of the nurses said they spend 1 to 2 hours. 33% of the nurses said that they spend 2 to 3 hours documenting an admit. And 55% of the nurses who responded said that they spend more than 3 hours documenting an admit. And I will tell you, my experience in pretty much any of the EMRs that we have used is about 3 hours. And I'll say I'm pretty quick and I'm pretty efficient, but it takes me about 3 hours to document an admit. So, I mean, this is something to think about, especially on those Friday afternoons when you get the phone call. We work with this one client, and I love their staff and their office staff. And they have this real sweet girl in the office, and she would call me at 3:15 on a Friday afternoon, because that's when the admits come in. And she would say, Shelley, can you please go do this admit for me? It's going to be quick. I promise you, it's not going to take that long. And I would be like, and say her name, there's no such thing as a quick admit, because, okay, I can probably do the admit and be done with the admit by 4:30 or 5, but I've got 3 hours of documenting on top of that. So, I mean, if we look at that, let's say I did do this admit. Let's say I did this admit at 3 o'clock and I finished it at 4:30. I drive home, and in the traffic and everything home, I get home at 7:30. I'm going to go, I mean, not 7:30, at 5:30, I get home. I'm going to go inside. I'm going to spend a couple of hours with my family. And then I'm going to sit down to document at, say, 8 o'clock. This is kind of an average day, weeknight. I'm going to sit down at 8 o'clock to document. So I saw 6 patients for that day. So I've got 3 hours of documenting with those 6 patients. And now I have the admit that I had to do. So that's another 3 hours. So that's 6 hours of documenting. I'm documenting until 2 o'clock in the morning. And I would tell y'all that is not uncommon at all. That's a real pretty average scenario in places where we have to do the documenting too. So we want to remember that there really is no such thing as a quick admit in this day and age. So then we asked the nurses how they were compensated for after hours documentation. And so 7% said that they were well compensated for the after hours documentation. 12% said that they were fairly compensated for the after hours documentation. Another 12 said they were partially compensated. 15% said poorly compensated, and 55% said that they were not compensated for the after hours documentation. And so I know that the majority of the nurses are paid a salary, and I understand that salary is based on give you this amount of money, and for these X number of dollars, the work is done, however long it takes for the work to be done. And in the regular industry, in most industries, that works out. It usually washes. Like 1 week I may work 40 hours, the next week I might work 45, but the next week I might work 35. So it kind of washes out. And I think in nursing back when things were done on paper and it was a little simpler, it probably washed out pretty well back then too. But I think that what's happening is we are losing some of that wash on the nurses' part. So let's look at, if let's say we pay a nurse $75,000 a year, which is about your average in most places in the United States, around $75,000 a year. So if that nurse works 40 hours a week, that's $36 an hour. And I mean, that's a good salary. I think that anybody would say that 36 an hour is good and is fair for the work that we do. But let's break it down in hospice nurse world and see what that looks like. So let's say I work 40 hours a week seeing my patients, and I'm driving to see all my patients, and I'm doing that takes me about 40 hours a week. And then I'm documenting, if I'm spending just 2 hours a night at home documenting, that's an additional 10 hours that week. And then let's say I get 2 admissions that week. So that's another 6 hours of documenting at home on my own time. And then also we got IDG, so I have to do IDG prep, which I know most of us usually do that on the weekends, not uncommon, but I spend about 2 hours preparing for IDG. This would probably be an average week. So this comes out to 58 hours a week, which is going to be an average week for the nurse, which when we do the math on that comes out to $25 an hour. And so in this day and age, there's a lot of jobs that we can do at $25 an hour that are a lot less stressful than hospice nursing. So we need to work on maybe not paying our nurses more, because I think what we're going to talk about a little down the road is how do we get them closer to that 40 hours a week. So we also ask the nurses, do they feel they spend more time on patient care or more time on documenting? Kind of break that up. So 14% of the nurses that responded said they spend more time on patient care. 23% said they spend an equal amount of time on patient care. And a whopping 63% said they spend more time documenting than they do on patient care. I mean, and think about that. So we spend more time writing about what we did than actually doing it. That seems incredible to me. That seems incredible to me, but that was the majority of the nurses felt this way. And let me give you an example, because things change. Like back in the old days, whenever we used to do, I would say, I'm going to document that I provided oxygen safety education to my patient. This is what I would document. And this was perfectly acceptable. Education provided on oxygen safety. I'm done with that. But over the last many years, things have progressed. I think probably because of surveys, getting dinged on surveys and different things like that. I know it was said, well, it's not good enough to just say that. You need to put what you educated on. So then we had to add all of the education that we provided on the oxygen safety. And that went along like that for a little while. And then I guess somewhere another ding came about where the surveyor said, well, now you need to tell us who you documented, who you provided the documented to. So we had to say, we provided the oxygen safety education, everything that we documented on, who we documented, patient and caregiver. So we went along like that for a while. And then it came, well, how do we know they understood it? Okay, so now we had to document education provided on oxygen safety, exactly what we educated on, who we educated, and that they verbalized understanding. So that went along for a while. And now the thing that I'm seeing is that, well, just saying they verbalized is not good enough. Now you have to tell us if they really understood it. How do you know? So now we have to document. So this simple documentation here became this. So everything that we have to document now, that one same thing, all the way down to patient and caregiver demonstrated competence in oxygen safety. So, but the interesting thing is that with all of this documenting, nothing changed in the patient care. Not a single thing changed from this to this. I still did the exact same care with the patient. The difference went from documenting one line to documenting a giant paragraph. So this is a point where I think we need to look at a lot of this. And yeah, I'm probably one of the ones that was guilty of a lot of this because I was vice president of compliance for a company. So I was always the one saying, let's do the extra, let's say the extra, let's put all this in just in case. And now I feel kind of bad about that. And I'm trying to rectify some of that, but we really need to advocate for our nurses and at some point say, we aren't going to have our nurses write all of that. If it's not making a difference in the care for the patient, do we really need to write all of that stuff in there? It's just a thought, just a thought. So I'm going to get off of the documentation soapbox. I could talk about that forever because it's really something I feel strongly about. And I do a lot of speaking on documentation and I write a lot of books on it. And it's just something that I think that we can fix and we can do for our nurses, but I'm going to be off that soapbox for now. So the next thing that we ask the nurses is, what do they consider most important and least important when they're looking for a new job, when they're looking for a hospice agency to be their forever hospice agency where they want to stay and always work? So we let them pick from these things here. We had them rate them from least important to most important. So sign-on bonus, 0% of the nurses put the sign-on bonus as important at all. They all said it was dead last in everything. And I know that sign-on bonuses have been around forever. They were around when I became a nurse. And it makes sense. It seems logical if we are trying to attract someone and we offer them money. But what has happened over the years, and this is what I'm hearing this from nurses out there pretty frequently. It has become viewed as kind of a red flag. So nurses, I had a nurse say this to me not that long ago. She said, the bigger the sign-on bonus, the faster I run, because that's not a place where I want to work. And I think that the perception is, accurate or not, the perception is if they're having to offer a bunch of money, it must not be a good place to work. So I think that this is good in a way though, because I think most companies right now have allocated funds for sign-on bonuses, but if they're not that effective, maybe we can take that money and put it somewhere else that will work in retention or some other way to attract nurses to us other than the sign-on bonus. So 3% of the nurses said the benefits were most important to them. Another 3% said minimal driving time. Only 4% said admit nurse. I thought that would be higher, but 4% said a dedicated admit nurse was important. 8% said flexible schedules were important. And this is something that we're going to talk about a little bit more in the solution area. 17% said a dedicated on-call nurse was important to them, the most important thing. 32% said the rate of pay. And 34% of the nurses said that maintaining the nurse to patient ratios was the most important thing to them. So in fact, here's just some of the verbatims of what the nurses said about the nurse to patient ratios. And what we asked them, the way we got these verbatims is one of the last questions we had for them was, in a perfect world, if you could have it exactly the way you wanted it, what would you like to see changed, or what would you like to see different in nursing, in hospice nursing? And these are the answers that they gave us. So decreasing the nurse to patient ratios, having better RN case manager ratios. I like the last one where it says patient ratio should be adjusted to lower manageable nurse to patient ratios based on acuity and distance traveled. 12 is a good number. That person gave a lot of solutions in there with whatever they said for their idea. But you can see the rest of what they have to say if you do get the verbatims from Molly. But so of the areas that we said we came up with, that were the 3 main areas that were identified through this: documentation, patient ratios, and compensation. So after reviewing the data from the survey, and we're looking at this, and I'm looking at the problems, and I'm thinking, what kind of solutions can we do? What can we do to help with this? It really dawned on me that these all really feed one into the other. If we can solve one, it may help solve the other ones. If we can fix some of these documentation problems, we may be able to see more patients, because if I'm not having to spend so much time documenting, I can see more patients. I mean, that makes sense. And if we fix the documentation problems, also, we're not doing all the after hours work. So compensation, we already figured out that our compensation is fair for 40 hours a week for working. So really fixing the documentation is going to be one of the main things that we're going to talk about, how to do solution-wise, because it will help with all of the other issues. So here's some solutions for solving some of the documentation issues. The first thing that I recommend is form a task force. And please use hospice nurses from the field. Get your nurses that are out there using it every day. If you're a large company and you have multiple agencies, I recommend bringing in a nurse from every single one of your agencies, bringing in a nurse from the field. You know, with Zoom and all of that these days, it's so much easier for us all to meet as a group. But I really think it's critically important because I spent a lot of time on the executive side, setting up EMRs and getting them ready to go. And I really thought that I understood how they worked, but I really didn't. Sometimes what looks really good in the boardroom and as it is explained by the reps for the EMRs, that sounds great, doesn't actually translate that well in the field. It doesn't work the way we think it's working. So it's so important that you have these nurses that are out there using it every day on this task force to make sure that you are understanding where your issues are with your documentation. And then the very first thing I recommend that you do is remove your redundancies. I promise you, if you ask the nurses on your task force, they can tell you right now, I bet you they can list 5 to 10 redundancies right off the top of their head in the EMR to get that fixed. And, you know, we already figured that that's going to take, best case scenario, an hour out of their additional documentation. So getting those removed. And I have found a lot of times the redundancies are things that we have added back into the software. So some softwares come with it built in, but probably 75% of the redundancies that I see are ones that the company has customized the EMR and they put this stuff back in. For example, there's one company where every time that we document, we are required to document the name of the funeral home and the address and the phone number. We physically have to type that into a place in the note. But it's something we just go back into the EMR and look at it because it's already in the EMR. Or we see a lot of it requiring us that we have to document how many bowel movements they've had, usually in multiple different places, or just several things that we've added in there. We want to make sure, take those out. Those you can remove easily. Any other redundancies, you can work with your EMR to have them remove the redundancies as well. I think they would appreciate some of the feedback also. Next thing that I recommend, make sure you understand your EMR. Like I said earlier, what it looks like from the boardroom and from the back end of it does not always translate well to the field. So make sure that you understand it. If you have to ride out in the field and use it, have your leaders go out in the field and use it in reality to see how it really does work. Then resolve any flow efficiencies. So what I mean by flow efficiencies, and y'all are going to think this is super picky and kind of crazy, but if things need to flow. So if your choices when you're going through your checkup assessment and that kind of thing, excuse me. If your choices are yes, no, maybe, yes, no, maybe, yes, no, maybe, make sure they stay in that exact same order. I mean, sounds picky, but it is really simple neurologistics. You want everything to flow easily so that it doesn't stop my brain. Because if I'm going yes, no, maybe, yes, no, maybe, yes, no, maybe, no, maybe, yes, that stops me. And okay, now I got to get back in my groove. Also, make them all the same case. If it's all uppercase, keep them all uppercase, all lowercase, well, however you want to do it, just keep it consistent. Just so that it makes it flow easier and it's faster and easier for the nurse to go through. Then you can also use documentation templates. This is something I have a lot of these. Over years, I'm kind of like a nerd when it comes to this. When I would come up with something, I would document something on a particular system or a particular note that I thought sounded good. I would just save them. And I had notebooks full of these that I later translated into tablets. But if you can make a template, something for your nurse to go by, something for them to look at when it's the end of the day and they're tired and they're going like, how do I document to support this COPD patient? What is some wording that I can use? We're not telling them how to document or what to say, but we're giving them just some idea of how to frame it and how to say the different things that we need to say. It makes it so much easier for them. And then lastly, I can't stress this enough, to educate. And I'm talking about educating on the usage of the EMR. I see this everywhere I go. nobody, I don't think anywhere I've ever been, anywhere I've ever worked, have we ever fully understand how to use the EMR. Even again, with companies, we work with, we have a lot of national clients and they'll have multiple agencies. But from agency to agency, the usage of the EMR is different because nobody really knows how to use it. So the nurses come up with their own workaround. And so you've spent a lot of money on this really great EMR that has all these bells and whistles, but nobody knows how to use the bells and whistles. And so what is a solution to that? Because I know we have super users. I've heard of super users. I've never actually met one. I mean, they're kind of like a unicorn. It's like somebody becomes a super user and they disappear. This seems like that's always what happens. Like I never know where the super users are. So I think that if I was going to be contracting with an EMR company, I would want it built into my contract that at every so many months, they come back and re-educate. So like you do your initial education, let the nurses go out in the field and use it. Then they come back at 6 months and they spend another couple of weeks with your nurses re-educating them. Because then the nurse has an idea how it works. They know the questions to ask. They know they can learn the other bells and whistles. And then maybe at a year, and just I would want them to come back periodically. I think that's something that they should do that I think would help a lot. So that's it for the documentation solutions. So for nurse to patient ratio solutions, the first thing that I recommend that you do is you measure your staff metrics every month. This is really important. And with staffing metrics, I'm talking about your turnover, your nurse to patient ratio, but also look at things like your death to admit ratio. So if you're admitting 30 patients, but you got 30 patients dying, and this is kind of what happens every month, that's a lot of work and a lot of paperwork on your nurses. So you want to know what that number is. Also, death in less than 7 days. This is an important metric for a lot of reasons, but for this particular reason, because if you're admitting patients and you're doing all that work and then they're dying and you're admitting, and it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. So you want to know what those numbers are. And I recommend you measure them every month so that if there are issues, you're able to intervene before it becomes too big of an issue and your nurses start leaving. The next thing you want to do is define safe ratios. This is something that's always up for discussion in hospice. Nobody has ever said, here's what safe patient ratios are. It's not mandated from anywhere. And it's really not a simple thing to do. It's much easier like in a hospital setting. In our setting, it's a little more difficult. I recommend that you have a task force, whether you use your same task force for your documentation, but involve your nurses in this. I think it's important for you to get their input, but I also think it's important for the nurses to be a part of this process so they can also see the challenges that you face in trying to make these patient ratios, because it's not as easy as it sounds. And I think having everyone work together will be a much more successful in getting this done. This is something I do think is long-term. I think this is going to take several months to do. And there's a lot of things you have to consider when you are looking at defining your safe patient ratios. So one of the things you want to look at is doing an acuity-based system. So acuity-based, that just really means how sick the patient is. The more sick, the more stuff the patient has going on, the more time they're going to take from the nurse. So in theory, that's easy. In a hospital, it's pretty easy. They've got, they're on the balloon pump, they've got a swans, they have these many wounds. This is their acuity. It doesn't really work that way for us, though. It's not as easy to do it that way in hospice. And on the next screen, I'm going to talk specifically about acuity basing in hospice. But another thing you want to consider when you're looking at your patient ratios is geographical challenges. And so what I mean by that is we can't just say distance. I can't just say, well, it's 30 miles versus 50 miles versus 10 miles. Because if I'm in Houston, 10 miles can take me 45 minutes, depending on the traffic. I live down in South Louisiana. I see some patients in a swamp. There's this one sweet little town that's way out in the swamp. It's like 20 miles down the road, which 20 miles isn't that far, but it's 20 miles down a swamp road. Takes forever to get down that road. Half the time it's flooded out. There's tractors, there's sugar cane, there's alligators. I mean, it takes probably 45 minutes to go that 20 miles on a good day, 45 minutes. So you want to look at these geographical challenges. Is it a place where you have to park really far away. Like I know, like in New Orleans, some of these apartment buildings, we park 10 blocks away and we got to walk 10 blocks back just to get to the patient. So you want to consider all of those things when you're looking at your nurse to patient ratios. And then most importantly, while you're defining your safe patient ratios and you're setting up this whole program, you really need to have a plan on how you're going to maintain the ratios. So at what point do we start looking for another nurse? At what point do we bring in our PRN nurses? At what point, how are we going to maintain this? Because that's the hardest part. Making it is easy, but maintaining it is hard. So I think you really need to have I recommend a very detailed plan on how you're going to follow that process. So getting back to the acuity based, excuse me, talking about factors in determining patient acuity in hospice. So like I said, it's a lot more difficult than it is in the hospital. So the first thing we look at is physical acuity. How many wounds they have? Do they have colostomies? Do they have the thoracentesis or paracentesis? Or what are we having physically to do to this patient that's going to take the nurse's time? And you assign that a number. Then you look at the emotional acuity. And when you're looking at emotional acuity, you also want to consider caregivers, because in my experience, caregivers are going to have the higher emotional acuity. I might do all of my patient stuff and be done in 15 minutes, but I may spend another 30 minutes with the family member. So also sometimes this can change. So early on, new admits, your emotional acuity may be higher. That may go down over time. So it may be something that you can adjust later. But you assign an emotional acuity and that gets a number that you add to it. Then what is their living situation? Are they living at home? Are they living in a nursing home? Are they living by themselves? Are they living with only one caregiver? Or are they living with a whole bunch of caregivers? Because, sometimes that can take a long time too. The more people that are around involved in there. Are they in a situation where caregivers take turns living with them? Because that always takes a lot of time. And if the patient is moving around, what is their living situation? And you assign a number to that. Then you look at demographic influences. And by demographic influences, I mean, where I live down in South Louisiana, if I go to Mamou, Louisiana, and I'm seeing a patient in Mamou, I can tell you that I'm going to walk down the patio and I'm going to sit down on the back porch with them. We're going to talk, we're going to chit chat, we're going to talk about our families and everything else for 10 or 15 minutes. And then we're going to go inside and we're going to start the visit. That's just how it is. That's how we have to do it down here. But if I'm seeing a patient in Houston, in a bigger city, a little more fast paced, they may not want the nurse in their home that long. They may want a nurse that comes in, does the visit and leaves. So you want to look at those demographic influences, and you assign a number based on that. And then lastly, you want to look at nurse safety. Is it an area where you're going to have to send 2 nurses, or an area where the nurse is going to have to bring someone with them every time that they go? And how much longer does it take, and that kind of thing? So you do that and you assign a number to that. And when you add these up, that's where you get your nurse to patient ratio number from. Now, I know I make it sound easy, and I realize it's a lot harder than that. And I think it's something that if we can all work together on this and come up with some processes to do this kind of universally across the board, I think would be the ideal solution. And so lastly, I don't have a lot to say about compensation, because I honestly think that compensation in most places is probably pretty much where it needs to be. We just need to fix the other issues. But you do want to make sure that you're paying a fair market wage. So are you paying what everyone else around you is paying or thereabout? So once you've done that, if you are, reduce or eliminate the after hours documentation so that your nurses are working close to 40 hours a week, as close to 40 hours a week as you can get them, so that what you're paying them, then it really is what is a good wage for them. And then make the plan to maintain your patient ratios. So that is the longer term. That's going to take a little while, but you can reduce the documentation and all of that now and adjust your wages if you need to. Something you could do pretty quickly, I think. So okay, and I'm getting close to my time. I have a couple of things that this didn't come from the survey, but these are things that I have just coming from my experience of being back in the field over the last several years, and things that I think are critically important. And I think that office support is critical. Your office team can make or break the experience for your nurse. I would make sure that your offices, that they understand that their number one job is to support the clinicians in the field, and that they're doing everything that they can to support the clinicians in the field. I would teach classes on it. I would put a lot into this because this is so critical. I've worked in places where we have one place where it's difficult to get to the patients. It's difficult work, it's hard work, but their office staff is so awesome that everyone on my team just loves to work there. They're all like, I'm going to go work there. And we have some other places where maybe more in town and a little bit easier patient care, but nobody wants to work there because the office is so hard to work for. And I'm talking about just the people in the office. So make sure you know about how much support you're getting from your office and help train them on what the expectations are and what they can do to help the clinicians in the field. The next, I think that's really, really important is administrative support. Having the DON in the office, having that clinical leader in the office whenever possible. I know that sometimes it's just not possible because we're short-staffed and they have to go out and see patients. But I don't recommend making that a general condition of their job. I don't recommend saying, well, we're going to use our DON as staff on a regular basis, just whenever you have to. Because having that person in the office takes a huge load off of the nurses because they can really help the nurses in the field so much. Also, vendor support and service. This is really important, especially of late. We've been seeing lots of issues with that. But you want to make sure that your nurses are not constantly having to be on the phone with the DME company and with the pharmacy company because they didn't deliver what they're supposed to, or the stuff isn't working, or anything like that. Talk with your nurses and find out, make sure that the service being provided is meeting their needs, because we really should make one call and know that the meds are going to be delivered, know that the DME is going to be there, and not have to deal with it a whole bunch after that. And then also consider flexible schedules. Flexible schedules, something that I think we need to, as a hospice as a whole, look at and talk about. But what if we do something like more traditional hospice nursing, where the nurses work 12-hour shifts because they're working 12 hours anyway. So what if you do 12 hours, 3 days a week, and they have that 3 on and 3 off and 4 on and 3 off and that kind of thing. It's something to think about. It would roll you through the whole weekend, so you wouldn't need an on-call nurse on days on the weekend. I know that we do the 5-day a week for continuity of patient care, but what I see mostly right now is we don't have a lot of continuity of patient care anyway, because we're all so short-staffed. So I think it's something to consider and talk with your team about, and let's all talk about together and see if we can come up with some options to do a more flexible schedule for the nurses. So in summary, to put it all together, know your staffing metrics, know your staffing challenges, what challenges they're facing. Form that mastermind group or that task force, and include your field nurses. Make a plan to immediately fix your documentation redundancies. Plan to streamline your documentation process. Define your patient ratios and make a plan to maintain those ratios. Make a plan to increase the supportive capacity of the office, and make a plan for creative, flexible nurse schedules. And that is it. So I don't have any references in here except for our hospice nurse survey and then my experience in the field. And so I thank you guys so much today for being here and for letting me share this information with you. I don't know if anyone has any questions.
Thanks, Shelley. Yes, let's leave that presenter contact information up while we just kind of wrap up here. I really appreciate, Shelley, all the insight. It was truly powerful in such a going back to the basic sense, right? Sort of we've gotten away from some of those things. And really any hospice organization listening to this can really run with some of those solutions to really recruit and retain the best nurses. That's what we're all trying to do, right? So we had one question that we weren't able to answer in the chat that I can leave with you, Shelley, and it was more specifics on the criteria of the survey and the volume of participants you got in the survey.
So we had 155 people that responded. The criteria was that they were registered nurses and that had worked in the hospice the hospice field within the last 5 years.
5 years. Okay. So just the two basic criteria. Perfect. Hope
Yes.
that answers your question. I do appreciate your time again, Shelley. Thank you. And thank you for everyone for attending. You guys have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay, thank you. Bye.